I'm Cierra Bettens. Welcome to APTN News InFocus. This week, we're putting the federal election in focus. For the past 3 weeks or so, we've been inundated with promises of prosperity, wealth, and good governance from the three main political parties. But when the federal election campaign trail kicked off at the beginning of April, party leaders' promises to Indigenous peoples were few and far between. At the start of the campaign, we spoke with Dennis Ward, the host of APTN National News, and Jennifer Laewetz, a political commentator and panelist on APTN's Truth in Politics panel. They rejoin us today to analyze what's happened between then and now. Jennifer, Dennis, thanks so much for joining us. So when we first talked about the federal election, you both emphasized the lack of Indigenous commitments from parties. How do you feel about that now, and has anything changed since then?
Well, I had a chance to briefly look at the Conservative Party platform this morning. It was just released, so obviously my opinions are going to be very surface level until I can do a full analysis. It does seem like there is some commitments from both of the major parties and the NDP as well, but really highlighting on the Liberal and Conservative Party. They both have a commitment to consultation, especially as they talk about resource development. The Liberals definitely prioritize the nation-to-nation and government-to-government relationship, whereas the Conservative Party just talks about the nation-to-nation consultation process, which is a little bit confusing on who it is that they're wanting us to consult with. Are they going to, provide a federal framework when it comes to consultation with the federal government, and even what that might look like provincially? Because it's really lacking the legal framework. The Liberal Party, of course, is talking about UNDRIP implementation, whereas there's no mention of UNDRIP in the Conservative Party platform. On the Liberal side, it includes Indigenous-led assessments. However, the Conservative Party one is a little bit more concerning because it talks about the speeding up of approvals for projects. So again, it's going to be very weird on how that fits in with consultation. And then I do like that both parties are talking about, infrastructure and capacity building when it comes to projects, with the Liberals promising doubling the capacity funding for our participation. But there's no mention of capacity funding for consultation in the Conservative Party platform.
Yeah, I mean, we're just getting the platforms this week with less than a week to go before the election. A lot of people will be interested in platforms, but in terms of like the casual person paying attention to what's going on in the election, I think they're probably, watching the news and watching the going to rallies or listening to the rallies, and we're just hearing the exact same things verbatim every single time. Everybody's just following the same script, maybe changing up what the announcement is that day, but I haven't heard any utterance of the word First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. And we're seeing also this week or today chiefs of Ontario and others putting out statements saying, look, there's got to be any development or legislation there that affects First Nations. There's got to be consent ahead of time. In Ontario right now, there's a comment period open on big changes that are happening to legislation there that are going to make it easier to do projects like mining projects, and we're not hearing anything about that really either.
Mm-hmm. On a similar note, how would you assess the three main party leaders' competence in discussing Indigenous issues when they're on the campaign trail?
I think, Jagmeet Singh is obviously the one that seems to be the most comfortable, mostly because I think that he's kept his door open to Indigenous issues throughout his time as leader. And from what I've heard from nations is that they feel comfortable talking to him, and like he feels comfortable being in those rooms. But at the same time, when they had the confidence and supply deal, there was a real opportunity to champion some Indigenous issues, and he didn't do that. Mark Carney, you can tell he's new to being a politician, and he is uncomfortable. He's made some mistakes on national media, interchangeably, calling us First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and kind of like mixing some of those up, and then using the broad term of Indigenous when he's not really comfortable with who it is that he's defining. You can tell that he's kind of new at this and still needs a little bit more practice. Pierre, I think he carries a lot of guilt and maybe a little bit of nervousness with him. And I think that's why he has a hard time directly addressing us and talking about some of these issues. So it's going to be interesting to see what this actually looks like in the next few years, because it seemed like, Justin Trudeau did a lot on the front of reconciliation. Granted, there was a lot of talking. There was still some promises that were met, but he seemed to be the most comfortable. So it's going to be interesting to see what the next 4 years look like.
Yeah, a lot of government organizations, First Nations government or organizations like the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs put out a list of things they'd like to see leaders do and ask for leaders to respond to them. The only one I've seen so far is Jagmeet Singh, and the NDP did respond to the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. But I believe that Pierre Poilievre is doing some sort of virtual town hall type of thing with the Assembly of First Nations, and I'm really looking forward to that. I think a lot of people will be looking forward to that.
Mm-hmm. And so, Jennifer, you mentioned earlier that you read through some of the Conservative Party's platform that was just released this morning. And I'm wondering, on first read, does anything in particular stand out to you?
Yeah, it's very economic reconciliation heavy, which, I know that we're at a time right now where nations want to start practicing self-determination and getting more involved in projects. But the Liberals seem to do a little bit of a better job of balancing that economic piece with the advancement of some of the social issues. Neither party has any type of solidified commitment to Bill C-92, which is incredibly concerning for me, because our nations are currently, in the midst of developing child welfare, and that capacity funding after June, we don't really know where that's going to go. So it would have been nice to see what the government's plan is to work with nations, because we've already seen that it's kind of ineffective at the AFN level. But yeah, that's kind of the biggest thing I've seen. And the TRC calls to action, there's no reference in the Conservative Party platform to TRC calls to action or missing and murdered Indigenous women. However, on the Liberal side, there is a commitment to the TRC calls to action. But with that being said, they've always made that commitment, and our TRC calls to action have been at a standstill. So that's kind of where I'm at.
Mm-hmm. And then a question for both of you. I'm wondering if you could each pick out a policy from any of the parties that impressed you.
I guess not really. Nothing's really stood out to me as like, whoa, that's a pretty big change, or that's going to be a big policy there. Like I said, I don't feel like I've heard anything new or exciting since day one of the campaign, but that's kind of just how I am, I guess. It's been a long time since I've thought of that we've had any exciting political leaders, but yeah, nothing's really standing out to me right now.
In the Liberal Party platform, there is actually a policy that's not Indigenous related, but it has to do with disabilities. And I'll wait for BCANs, which is Canada's one of their top Indigenous disability advocacy groups. I'm going to wait for their full analysis, but I did see that the Liberals are promising disability tax credit reform, which is a commitment basically for them to review and reform the disability tax credit, which absolutely needs to happen because it's been kind of a nightmare to access and hasn't been super accessible. It is kind of interesting because the Conservatives are promising to simplify and rename the disability tax credit. So I'm a little bit confused what that means when they're talking about simplifying it. But I will say that I am very happy to see that there is some caregiver support and also some commitment to autism support workers. But that's kind of what stood out for me is where the two parties went in terms of disability policy.
And so on the other hand, I'm wondering, have there been any red flags or policies that have concerned you that have come up in party platforms or on the campaign trail?
Nothing really on that end either. I think everybody's just trying to play it so safe right now and stick to script. And I think the Liberals are hoping that they can just keep riding this lead that they have going in. And I feel like the Conservatives are trying not to rock the boat and hope that maybe the polls are a little bit wrong. And I think the NDP is just really trying to stay alive, keep party status here, and hit on some of the things that happened. We did a panel a couple of weeks ago, and I've thought about this a lot. Nigon saying that Jagmeet Singh was the most impressive or best leader the NDP's had in our lifetime. And I said during that panel, well, what about Jack Layton? And Onigaming was right. Like, if it weren't for Jagmeet Singh and the NDP and the minority government, like, there wouldn't be these pharmacare deals that are taking place. Dental, like, I remember my sister had to take out a loan to get my nephew's teeth fixed a couple of years ago. So, like, those are pretty big things that happened in the last government that might not have happened if it weren't for the NDP. So I think Onigaming was right there about Jagmeet Singh.
Mm-hmm. Jennifer, did you have any red flags that popped up for you?
Not really, other than the fact that I think that we're shifting in a really weird direction with politics right now, where these political party leaders seem very, very heavily governed by the internal party. And it's almost like they're governing from a place of all of the people around them telling them how to govern rather than what their strengths are that got them into that leadership role in the first place. And, Jagmeet Singh seems to be one of those people that when he's outside of the chamber and he's on the ground, he has this unique way of being able to connect with people. But on a national stage, he's not being taken seriously, and the party is at risk of even losing party status because people have just lost all faith. It'll be interesting to see what that looks like with Mark Carney and the PMO, and Pierre, same thing, where this election seemed very guarded. It seemed very gatekeep. It's like we weren't getting to see the inside of how his brain normally functions any other time.
Yeah, and I would say that trickles all the way down to candidates. Like, I've barely seen any conservative candidates get interviewed. I don't think we've had one that's agreed to do an interview with us during this campaign. I despise the fact that everyone that's running for prime minister of this country only takes a certain amount of questions, and that the national media gets to control those questions most of the time. If you're running to be the prime minister of this country, you should be able to stand up there and answer any question that's thrown at you. And these campaigns have just become so managed and stuck to script that let's maybe not make them so long. And this is even a short campaign, one of the shortest, I believe. And wrap it up almost, I feel, because we're not hearing anything new here.
I guess on that topic, Dennis, this isn't the first election that you've covered. I'm wondering, how candidates are interacting with media and journalism. Do you think it's different this time, or is it kind of the same as it's always been in terms of, not wanting to take questions or kind of limiting media presence? Is there anything that's significantly changed for this election?
Well, our reporter TR did a story the other day covering the Kenora riding, and the incumbent Conservative MP there. She had calling the office, trying to get an interview with them, and mentioned, this wasn't the first time that that Conservative MP or person running for office right now had not responded to APTN to do interviews. I think it was the 2015 election. I covered that riding, and then Conservative politician Greg Rickford, he was willing to do it. It took a while, but he was willing to do the interview. I think this campaign, it's become like an issue of who gets to ask the questions and what questions they're asking. And there was a CTV reporter the other day complaining about certain ethnic media were getting questions to ask, and the national media, it should be the national media who's asking these questions. And I said, well, I don't know if you think of us as sorry, it wasn't a CTV, but if APTN's an ethnic media in your opinion, but we haven't been able to ask one question of the Conservative leader yet. We were even told tomorrow you'll get your question, and it didn't happen again. And so there seems to be, even the media themselves are trying to say who should be able to ask the question, saying that local media has a role to play, but maybe next time around there'll be more time for the local media to be able to ask questions. I don't like any of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And another thing is the Assembly of First Nations has identified 36 ridings where First Nations could swing the vote. And in terms of candidates and campaign platforms, are there any developments in these ridings that stand out to you?
I haven't seen any specific developments. I think the only big riding I'll be paying attention to is Edmonton Northwest with the former chief of Enoch, Chief Billy Morin. He's running for the Conservative Party. And he was the youngest chief that was elected to Enoch and the Confederacy of Treaty 6. So I'll be very interested to see if that support in Edmonton North picks up and sends him to Parliament, and what that'll look like to see a former chief sitting as a member of the Conservative Party in the House.
Yeah, we kind of talked about this on a panel too. Maybe it's time to revisit that list of 36, like the Kenora riding, 99% lock for the Conservatives. Thunder Bay Superior North Indigenous Services Minister Patty Haidu's riding, 99% chance of being reelected. But I think where we are seeing that on the ground is Churchill, Keewatin Aski, where longtime MP Nikki Ashton is in for a real battle with Rebecca Chartrand, who didn't run last time but has ran in the past. That one's showing, I think it's like 1% difference between the two of them right now. That's going to be almost likely to come down to an automatic recount, I bet, if those polls hold. So yeah, that's going to be one of the ridings I'm definitely going to be watching election night.
Mm-hmm. And so going back to the lack of Indigenous inclusion in party platforms, do you think there's any way, between now and election day to turn that around? I
don't think so. I think, these priorities are things that need to be worked on over time. And I think, as Indigenous people, we're kind of getting tired of seeing the words written on paper, but the paper's not worth anything. It's a committed effort over the years to really showcase that you are, at the end of the day, committed to Indigenous issues. And you can't just throw some words in a platform and think that people are going to be sold by that. And I'm not sold on any of these parties on their Indigenous priorities.
Yeah, I think not a chance are we going to hear anything about Indigenous priorities over the next 6 days here. I'd be shocked if we see one of the leaders of the two leading parties even come back to the prairies. I think everybody's going to be tight on script over the next 6 days, traveling around Quebec and southern Ontario, and it's going to be more of the same for the next 6 days.
All right. Well, Jennifer, Dennis, thanks so much for joining us and talking about the election again.
Thank you.
Thanks.
That's the question about what the federal government could do and what's changing. The reality is that the federal government invested a lot, but they didn't target it, in my view. And there's probably 70 to 80 communities just like Onigiming across the country. A lot of them in this riding that you talk about that don't have road access or don't have any type of transportation access or transportation corridors. And if I was part of this government, which I was in this very early
That is the voice of Jeffrey Copenis, chief of Onigaming First Nation in Northern Ontario. APTN News recently traveled to the community to learn about the issues affecting it. And since there's a federal election taking place, what promises are being made to help its residents? Our Parliament Hill reporter, Karyn Pugliese, was there, and she joins me from New York. Thanks so much for joining us, Karyn. So to start, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little about Onigiming. Where is it and about how many people live there?
Yeah, Onigiming is a First Nation. It's in Northern Ontario, and it's north of Kenora, just a little over an hour's drive. And it's an isolated community, like there's not much around. There's a few hotels. We stayed in a hotel called the Mile High Hotel. And basically, when we arrived there, they just texted us and said, the door's unlocked, just walk in, the keys are there. It's that type of community. There's a small grocery store there. We went to go pick up milk. They were out of milk. So it could be days before they get milk. And then when you get onto the reserve, it doesn't take you very long to drive around. We did a little tour with the chief. He took us to see the water treatment plant. He took us to see their Jordan's Principal Center, their school, and there's a health center tied to the band office, and then a little scattering of homes here and there. And he also took us to see the graveyard.
Mm-hmm. And when you were there, what were you looking to sort of, ask the community about?
Well, I mean, in a way, we were going to do an election story, but I'd been in touch with Chief Pugliese sort of over a couple of years because the community's been in the news. And what we're really thinking is that a lot of the elections, like at least the talk from the Liberal and Conservative leader has focused really on mineral extraction and energy projects and, really doing business with what we would call have First Nations. But Onigiming is a have-not First Nation, and it's decided not to extract gold. So that's why we went there. We wanted to understand how they fit into this election, sort of one of those communities that's left behind.
Mm-hmm. So as you mentioned, Onigiming has been in the news because of the struggles that the community has been facing. Can you talk a bit more about what's going on?
Sure. I mean, it's been under a state of emergency for more than 10 years, since 2014. And that's when there was a little cluster of suicides in the community. And they brought in some mental health programs, but they've been struggling with that and struggling with high levels of addiction really ever since then. They've never lifted that state of emergency. They're still under it. In addition, I guess a couple of years ago, there was a death where somebody had overdosed, and an ambulance from Kenora, they have to get all their medical from Kenora, which is far away. They don't have anything locally or more locally than that. And the ambulance showed up and the house was flagged, which they tell me means that the ambulance is supposed to wait for police. So the ambulance waited there for police to arrive for 20 minutes and the person passed away. We were able to talk to a couple people who were on the scene, and even though it's been 2 years, they're still really affected by it.
The reality is that the federal government invested a lot, but they didn't target it, in my view. And there's probably 70 to 80 communities just like Onigiming across the country. A lot of them in this riding that you talk about that don't have road access or don't have any type of transportation access or transportation corridors. And if I was part of this government, which I was in this very early days, I advocated so hard to target those communities that are most in need. And I didn't see that from this government the past 10 years. What I saw was them leave most of their programs and their policies to bureaucrats, again, who have no idea about the reality of what it's like to live in a First Nation in this country. And what I saw was a bunch of dollars just open to application. And if you're a First Nation that's doing well, or if you're a regional organization or a national organization like the AFN or Chiefs of Ontario, you're gonna scoop up all of those dollars and you're gonna do great. But if you're a First Nation that is racing, like myself, where I'm literally racing from scene to scene, I was at the scene where a young man broke his arm this morning. And you're on the scene. And when you're in a state of emergency, that's the reality of governing. You're in your office 1 second and you're at the next accident. You're at the next tragedy. And that's how life has been here. And we don't have the time, we don't have the capacity, we don't have the regular consultants that are chasing down all of these dollars. So all of these dollars, to me, over the past 10 years, I've seen when it comes to First Nations, the rich get richer. I've seen the most successful become more successful, and good for them. I'm not gonna be negative on First Nations that are achieving success, but I'm seeing a lot of First Nations being left behind, and I'm seeing the gap between rich and poor become even greater when it comes to First Nations in this country. And I think that's what's
So that was a chief of Onigiming, and it sounds like, rushing from crisis to crisis is basically a full-time job for the chief. But I'm wondering, Karyn, what supports does Onigiming need?
Well, one of the things that's happening there is they went to Jordan's Principle, and they were getting supports through Jordan's Principle. So they were able to put in an emergency crisis team, which was really helpful for the community. They tell me, when I go there, Like everything's kind of quiet and it's a clean community and things look nice, but there's a lot of crises that are happening. People stay inside their house and they might be using drugs, or they might be struggling with depression or mental health issues, and it just comes out at night. And so they need these emergency services to go and just help people at that moment when they're in crisis. The night that we were there, there was a man who had been drinking, and he got lost up in the woods, and people could hear him yelling, "Hey, hey." And so the emergency crisis unit was able to go up there, go through the forest and find him and take him out, which was good because it was a cold night. Like the river had frozen over at that point, so it would have been bad for him to have been caught out there. So they have stuff like that. Then a lot of programs for the kids, they're doing a lot of after school programs, things to keep the kids busy, things to engage the kids in culture. And what they talk about is they talk about the community needing to heal. And so you see that side of things. The chief told me that there were 43 deaths in the community. And we're talking about a community that all encompassed on and off reserve is about 800 people. And just a little over half live on reserve. So that's a big portion of the community to have 43 deaths in just a couple of years. So there's that side of the community. But on the other hand, it's just this community that's had, really produced some amazing people. Diane Kelly is from Onigiming, and she is helping right now with their trust fund. And they have a trust fund from a couple of disasters. Like they got compensated for their land being flooded without their permission and for bad water. And so they've invested that money, and Diane Kelly manages the trust fund, but she's also the former Grand Chief of Treaty 3. And she talked to us a little bit about the, sort of the other side of the community.
I faced a lot of racism, but to me, one of the things that helped me to stand up strong was all the things that my father taught me about being Anishinaabe and how proud I was of that. So even though you get that look or that whatever it is, I knew that I was okay. And so we have to share that with the younger people and the generations coming forward, that there's a lot to be proud of here. Look at our chief here. He was the first Indigenous person to be in a prime minister's office. We've got the first premier from our community. We have the first female Grand Chief from our community. We have so many people to be proud of here. We have a teacher teaching the Masters of Indigenous Knowledge and Social Work from our community at the University of Manitoba. We have a professor at Harvard. We have so much to be proud of here. And sometimes I don't know that we know that. And part of being Anishinaabe, we don't go around and say, we're humble, but there is a lot to be proud of.
Moving on to the federal election, I'm wondering, what are parties promising that could help, if anything?
Well, there's on the good side, there's two Indigenous candidates running in the riding. There is Tanya Cameron, who's running for the NDP, and Charles Fox, who's running for the Liberals. And so there's kind of a sense that Indigenous candidates are going to understand what an Indigenous community is going through. What I will say is that Tanya Cameron, her signs were everywhere in the community, and she dropped off some bingo dabbers, and she'd been there recently. And we chatted to her a little bit about the community, and she seems to understand really what their needs are. But in a race where it's going to be between the Liberals and the Conservatives, there is a lot of talk about pushing resources, getting resources out of the ground. Both the Liberals and the Conservatives federally, the leadership, Pierre Pulier and Mark Carney, have talked about speeding up approvals processes, speeding up getting goods to market. And a lot of this pressure, of course, on this election is coming from the South. It's coming from Donald Trump, the tariffs, the idea that Canada has to rebuild its economy and can't rely on its trading partnership with the US anymore. And so they want to get critical minerals out into new markets, and they want to speed up all the processes. And that means speeding up First Nations approvals. And so this community is in sort of an awkward spot. I mean, it's ironic that what happened is their Jordan's Principle funding got cut. And largely that was because it was group funding. And what the chief said is under the new application processes that Indigenous Services Canada has put in since February, that basically he would have to get every kid like a signed doctor's note in order to keep maintaining these group services they have. So he's not able to do that. There's no doctor in the community. And so they started paying out of those trust funds that I was telling you about, which come from people not consulting them about the use of their land, basically. And so now they joined a group that had signed on to a gold mine in the area back around the same time that there was a health crisis in the community in 2014. And the former chief told me that she just had no capacity to really give consent. And so when you're sitting there and you're talking about speeding up consent for a community like this, that isn't thrilled with the idea of participating in mining, that is very concerned about protecting the water around it, and you're going to try to get minerals and mines built there and give them a year, that's the election issue that is weighing heavily on this community. And, you know, the chief says, like, they're interested in building an economy. They're just not interested in mining. And locally, the people there have lots of ideas for tourist-based economies and other ways to go forward. So it's an election where there doesn't seem to be an alternative between the two parties that are leading in the polls for this community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I'm wondering, you know, with this election around the corner and there kind of not being an alternative for the community in terms of, you know, these party platforms with regards to mining and mineral extraction, what do you think the future holds for the people of Onigiming?
Well, what they're focused on is they're focused on healing. They're going to keep running the programs that they've got, like the mental health programs and the cultural programs and everything, at least another year. And then they have to decide, you know, like they have to decide every time where the money's coming from. But the feeling in the community is that, like, moving forward on anything, healing has to happen first. So they're very much focused on health, which hasn't been, and mental health, and addictions. Things that have kind of fallen off the topic of conversations in this election. But that's where they see going forward, is healing first, then building the economy, and they want to do it on their own terms.
Well, thanks so much for joining us again, Karyn. Always appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This episode of In Focus was produced by Mark Blackburn and Charmaine Straker, with editing by Jesse Andrushko, and hosted by me, Cierra Bettens. If you're enjoying the show, let us know by leaving a rating and review. You can find more APTN podcasts like APTN News Brief and Truth in Politics on aptnnews.ca/podcasts or on your favorite player. Thanks for listening.
APTN Investigates delivers impactful, Indigenous-focused stories that change lives and reveal the bigger picture. On this week's show,
I'm Kenneth Jackson. Our investigative series, Secrets of the Bay, has led to a critical revelation that has police rethinking the drowning deaths of 2 Mohawk fishermen in 2015 in what they once believed was an accident.
APTN Investigates. Immediately following APTN National News.